supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, just me and a couple of friends, Mike and Sarah. We picked a remote spot deep in the woods, far from the usual crowded campsites. It was perfect, a small clearing surrounded by towering trees with a serene lake nearby. The first day went off without a hitch. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and spent the evening roasting marshmallows and telling ghost stories. As the night grew darker, the woods around us seemed to close in, but the fire kept the darkness at bay. We eventually retired to our tents, lulled to sleep by the sounds of the forest. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of rustling outside my tent. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but then I heard whispering. It was faint, almost inaudible, but definitely human. I froze, straining to hear more. The whispers seemed to be coming from just outside our camp, moving slowly around us. I unzipped my tent just enough to peek out. The fire had died down to embers, casting an eerie glow over the campsite. I couldn't see anyone, but the whispers continued. I looked over at Mike and Sarah's tents. They were zipped up tight, and there was no movement. I was about to step out and investigate when I saw a figure moving through the trees. It was just a shadow, barely visible, but it was there. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if it was watching us. My heart raced. I didn't want to call out and wake my friends, not yet. I needed to be sure of what I was seeing. The figure disappeared into the darkness, and the whispers stopped. I waited, holding my breath, but nothing else happened. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was just my imagination and went back to sleep. The next morning, I told Mike and Sarah about what I'd seen. They laughed it off, saying I'd probably just been half asleep and dreaming. I wanted to believe them, so I let it go. We spent the day hiking and swimming in the lake, trying to put the eerie night behind us. That evening, as we sat around the campfire again, we heard it, a distant, high-pitched scream. It was faint, almost like the wind, but it sent chills down my spine. We all looked at each other, trying to gauge if anyone else had heard it. Mike tried to brush it off as an animal, but Sarah and I weren't so sure. We decided to stay up late, keeping the fire going and talking to keep our minds off the scream. Eventually, exhaustion got the better of us, and we retreated to our tents. I couldn't sleep. I lay there, listening, waiting for the whispers to return. And they did. This time, they were louder, clearer. I could make out words, but they didn't make sense. It was like someone was speaking in a language I didn't understand. Then I heard footsteps, soft, careful footsteps moving through our camp. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped my tent as quietly as I could. The fire was still burning, casting long shadows, and in those shadows I saw them. 3 figures standing at the edge of our clearing, just beyond the firelight. They were tall, with long matted hair, and their eyes seemed to glow in the dim light. They stood there, watching us, whispering to each other. I felt a surge of terror unlike anything I'd ever felt before. I knew I had to wake Mike and Sarah, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. One of the figures stepped forward, and I finally found my voice. I screamed, waking my friends. Mike and Sarah stumbled out of their tents, confusion and fear on their faces. I pointed at the figures, but they were gone. We didn't wait to find out who or what they were. We packed up our camp in record time, constantly looking over our shoulders, expecting to see those glowing eyes watching us. As we hiked back to our car, we heard the whispers again, following us through the trees. We never talked about what happened that night, not really. We told ourselves it was just our imaginations, that there was nothing out there in the woods. But I know what I saw, and I know I'll never go back to that place again. So, if you ever find yourself deep in the woods, far from anyone else, and you hear whispers in the dark, take my advice. Leave. Don't wait to find out who's watching you. Just leave. It was one of those nights where no matter how hard I tried, I just couldn't sleep. The clock showed 2 a.m. and my mind was racing with thoughts I couldn't quiet. I decided to get up and do something to tire myself out. Basketball had always been my go-to for clearing my head, so I threw on some clothes, grabbed my ball, and headed to the old court near my apartment. The court was tucked away in a small park, surrounded by trees and a chain-link fence. It was deserted, of course. Who else would be playing basketball at this hour? The streetlights cast a dim glow over the cracked asphalt, and the only sound was the distant hum of traffic. I started shooting hoops, the familiar rhythm of dribbling and the swish of the net calming my nerves. After a while, I got into a groove, feeling the tension in my body start to melt away. The night air was cool, and I began to enjoy the solitude. After about half an hour, I heard a noise behind me, footsteps shuffling in the darkness. I stopped dribbling and turned around, squinting into the shadows. I couldn't see anyone, but the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but got no response. Trying to shake off the unease, I went back to my game. But the footsteps started again, closer this time. I turned around quickly and my heart skipped a beat. There, standing just outside the circle of light cast by the street lamp, was a figure, tall, thin, and cloaked in darkness. "Hey, you need something?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty park. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. It just stood there, watching me. I felt a chill run down my spine. I took a few steps toward the figure, hoping to get a better look. But as I approached, it melted back into the shadows. The park seemed to grow colder, and I felt a deep sense of dread settle over me. I decided it was time to leave. Maybe a late-night basketball game wasn't the best idea after all. I grabbed my ball and started walking back towards my apartment, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. The path was eerily quiet, and the trees seemed to close in around me. I quickened my pace, the feeling of being watched growing stronger with each step. Just as I reached the edge of the park, I heard it again, the footsteps. But now they were running. I broke into a sprint, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I didn't dare look back, the sound of footsteps pounding in my ears. I burst out of the park and onto the street, my heart racing. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and when I finally looked back, there was no one there. The street was empty, the park silent. I stood there, catching my breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I hurried back to my apartment, locking the door behind me. I turned on all the lights and sat on the couch, clutching the basketball. The feeling of being watched lingered, and I knew I wouldn't be sleeping that night. The next morning, I told a friend about the experience. He listened, a serious look on his face. "You shouldn't have gone to that park alone at night," he said. "There are stories about that place. People say it's haunted by the spirit of a man who was murdered there years ago. They say he watches anyone who comes there after dark." I laughed it off, but deep down, I knew there was something more to it. I haven't been back to that park since, especially not at night. Whenever I think about it, I can still hear the footsteps behind me, and I wonder if the stories are true. It was the summer before my senior year of college when I moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of town. The rent was cheap and the area was quiet, which suited me perfectly. The only downside was my next-door neighbors. I rarely saw them, but when I did, something always felt off. The couple was in their late 30s, with the man tall and gaunt, and the woman petite with a perpetually haunted look in her eyes. They never greeted me, never made eye contact. The curtains on their windows were always drawn, and I never heard any sounds coming from their apartment. One night, around midnight, I was up late studying when I heard a strange noise coming from their apartment. It was a low, rhythmic thumping, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. I tried to ignore it, but the sound grew louder and more insistent. Curiosity got the better of me, and I tiptoed to my door, pressing my ear against the wall. "Help me." The voice was faint, almost drowned out by the thumping. My blood ran cold. It was a woman's voice, pleading and desperate. I grabbed my phone and debated whether to call the police when the noise stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was even more unsettling. The next morning, I saw the woman in the hallway. She looked worse than usual, her eyes bloodshot and hollow. I wanted to ask if she was okay, but the words caught in my throat. She noticed me staring and quickly retreated into her apartment, shutting the door behind her. That night, the noises started again. This time, it was louder, accompanied by muffled cries. I couldn't take it anymore. I called the police and reported what I had heard. They arrived within minutes and knocked on my neighbor's door. There was no answer. After several attempts, they forced the door open. What they found still haunts me. The apartment was dark and smelled of decay. The woman was tied to a chair in the living room, her mouth gagged and eyes wide with terror. The man was nowhere to be found. The police untied her and she clung to one of the officers, sobbing uncontrollably. As they led her out, she glanced at me and whispered, "Thank you." I moved out the next day, unable to shake the image of her terrified face. I never found out what happened to the man, but I couldn't help but wonder how long she had been trapped in that apartment, waiting for someone to hear her cries for help.